The wind arrived first, a living thing with claws that scraped skin from bone. 40 degrees below zero, the kind of cold that transformed breath into ice crystals before they could escape lips already cracked and bleeding. The horizon glowed dull red, not from sunset but from artillery fire 15 kilometers distant, a continuous thunder that had become the soundtrack to retreat. One soldier stood alone at the edge of what remained of the German position, his greatcoat stiff as sheet metal, watching shadows move through the distant tree line. Soviet shadows, always advancing, always closing the distance. His name no longer mattered. In 3 weeks, most names would cease to matter. The only label that would endure was location. Kholm, a village of 2,000 souls on the banks of the frozen Lovett River. Unremarkable in every way except one. 5,500 men would gather there to resist what should have killed them all. This story begins not with heroism, but with the simple arithmetic of survival. And the numbers from the very start refused to add up in Germany's favor. The soldier turned from the burning horizon. Behind him, the sound of engines coughing in the cold, metal grinding against metal, voices raised in desperate organization. The retreat had no dignity left. What had marched east 6 months ago with flags and songs now stumbled west with empty bellies and frostbitten feet, pursued by an enemy that seemed to multiply with every verst of Russian soil. Winter had arrived early and angry, as if the land itself had taken sides. The snow that blanketed everything was not peaceful. It was an accomplice to murder. In the east, the war had begun with supreme confidence. Operation Barbarossa, June 1941. 3 million German soldiers, 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, crushing across the Soviet border in the largest invasion history had ever witnessed. The plan was surgical. Strike fast, strike deep, decapitate the communist state before autumn leaves fell. Army Group North would take Leningrad. Army Group Center would seize Moscow. Army Group South would capture the breadbasket of Ukraine. The Führer's generals promised victory in 8 weeks, 16 at most. They had not accounted for space. The Soviet Union was not France. Roads that appeared on maps dissolved into mud tracks that swallowed entire divisions. Distances that seemed manageable in Berlin stretched into nightmares of logistics. A panzer division could advance 50 kilometers in a day through Poland. In Russia, 10 kilometers was an achievement. The land fought back with geography alone. By October, the offensive had stalled in the Rasputitsa, the season of mud when rain turned the earth into a bog that consumed trucks and tanks with equal appetite. Soldiers watched vehicles sink axle deep, then chassis deep, then disappear entirely as if the ground were digesting them. Horses, thousands upon thousands, died in their traces, too exhausted to continue. The men ate the horses, then they ate the leather of their own equipment, and still Moscow remained just beyond reach, its spires visible through field glasses, mocking them with proximity. November brought false hope. The ground froze solid. Mobility returned. The advance resumed. Army Group Center pushed to within 30 kilometers of the Kremlin. Forward observers could see the flash of searchlights over Red Square. One more push, the generals insisted. One final effort before the real winter arrived. But the Wehrmacht was bleeding from 1,000 cuts. Casualties had exceeded 400,000. Replacements were frozen solid in railroad cars that couldn't reach the front. Ammunition stocks dwindled. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated Soviet skies in June, now fought for every meter of airspace against rejuvenated Red Air Force squadrons. Then December came, and with it the realization that hell had temperature ranges. What the soldiers had endured in November was revealed as merely cold. December was something else. Temperatures plunged to 30 below, then 40. Oil froze in engines. Bolts shattered like glass when struck. Weapons became clubs because the firing mechanisms no longer functioned. Men learned that metal touching skin resulted in flesh tearing away when separated. Urination became an exercise in speed because exposed flesh froze in seconds. The wounded died not from their wounds but from cold that stopped their blood mid-flow. And then Stalin struck. Operation Winter Storm, December 5th, 1941. Fresh divisions from Siberia, men born to cold, trained in it, equipped for it, smashed into German lines that were already at breaking point. The First Shock Army appeared as if materialized from the blizzards themselves. The 20th Army drove into the flanks. The 10th Army encircled Tula. Along a front of hundreds of kilometers, the tide reversed. The Wehrmacht, which had never retreated since 1939, learned the taste of defeat, bitter, metallic, mixed with frozen blood. Army Group North found itself pushed back from its positions around Leningrad. Army Group Center reeled away from Moscow's suburbs. Entire divisions ceased to exist, not destroyed in single battles, but eroded day by day, fighting rearguard actions against an enemy that never seemed to tire. The Soviet numerical advantage, dismissed by German intelligence as fiction, proved devastatingly real. For every Red Army soldier killed, 3 more appeared. Conscripts from the Asian republics, workers' battalions from the Urals, naval infantry from the Pacific Fleet. Stalin was feeding men into the furnace faster than Germany could burn them. The retreat was not organized withdrawal. It was barely controlled chaos. Units lost contact with each other. Radio communications collapsed as batteries died in the cold. Supply lines stretched beyond breaking. A company that went into defensive position at dawn might find itself surrounded by dusk. Every route west cut by Soviet mobile groups that moved through the forest like wolves. Commanders faced impossible choices: stand and be encircled, or retreat and abandon the wounded. Most chose retreat. The screams of men left behind provided the soundtrack. Trucks that had carried supplies east now carried only the wounded west, packed so tightly that the dead remained standing, frozen in place among the living. Drivers pushed vehicles beyond any reasonable limit because stopping meant death. When fuel ran out, trucks were abandoned where they stood, their cargo left to whatever mercy the Soviets might provide. Usually there was none. Soviet infantry had seen what the Wehrmacht had done during the advance. Payback was measured in blood. The landscape became a gallery of horrors. Burned-out vehicles lined every road. Corpses frozen in positions of agony marked the shoulders. German and Soviet mixed together in death's democracy. Entire forests stood black and skeletal from artillery fire. Villages that had housed civilians now smoldered as ruins, torched by one side or the other to deny shelter. The snow, which should have been white, was stained brown with mud, black with ash, red with what had once flowed through human veins. In this maelstrom of collapse, certain points on the map gained sudden significance, not for what they possessed, but for what they represented, the last solid ground before the flood. Kholm was such a point. The village sat at a critical junction on the Lovot River, a nexus of roads that connected the northern and central fronts. If Kholm fell, the entire logistical network feeding the Demyansk pocket would collapse. 90,000 German soldiers depended on those supply routes. Lose Kholm, lose Demyansk. Lose Demyansk, and Army Group North would disintegrate. Soviet High Command understood this arithmetic perfectly. Stalin's directive to his generals was explicit and brutal. Close the ring around Kholm. Annihilate the garrison. Let it serve as an example of what awaits the fascist invaders. 3 armies received orders to converge on this single village of wooden houses and narrow streets. The Third Shock Army under Lieutenant General Maxim Prokofiev would strike from the north. Elements of the 33rd Army would push from the east. The 188th and 391st Rifle Divisions would close from the south. In total, more than 40,000 Soviet soldiers would be tasked with destroying whatever the Germans could gather at Kholm. Into this trap stumbled the remnants of divisions that had marched confidently toward Moscow 3 months prior. The 123rd Infantry Division, reduced to 30% strength. The 218th Infantry Regiment, its companies now the size of platoons. Engineers without equipment, artillery without guns, medical personnel without supplies, headquarters staff without communication, cooks, drivers, clerks, messengers, all carrying rifles they barely knew how to use because the infantry had been bled white. They converged on Kholm not through military planning, but through the simple logic of geography. It was the last place left to go. Among them was Gefreiter Hans Cooper, 25 years old, a mechanic from Hamburg who could disassemble and rebuild any engine blindfolded, but who had never fired a shot in anger before December. His hands, which had once been gentle with machinery, were now wrapped in rags because his gloves had disintegrated weeks ago. His boots were held together with wire. His face bore the peculiar, waxy pallor of early frostbite. In his breast pocket, he carried a letter from his wife announcing the birth of their daughter. He had read it so many times the creases were beginning to tear. The photograph enclosed showed a woman he barely recognized and a child he had never met. That photograph was the only warm thing left in his world. Hans had joined the Wehrmacht in 1939 with visions of seeing Paris. He had seen Paris, briefly, during the victory parade. Then the orders came for the Eastern Front. He had expected another quick campaign, another parade. What he found instead was a landscape that swallowed armies and a cold that turned men into brittle statues. His unit, the 8th Sapper Company, had been tasked with maintaining vehicles and equipment. By the time they reached Kholm's outskirts, there were no vehicles left to maintain. Only 17 men from the original company of 140 remained. Hans had become infantry by default, handed an MP-40 submachine gun, and told to fill gaps in the line. Walking beside him through the frozen twilight was Lieutenant Karl Weber, 29, a history teacher from Berlin who had taught his students about Napoleon's Russian campaign with clinical detachment. Now he was living it, and every lesson he had taught seemed like cruel foreshadowing. Weber had maintained a diary since crossing the Soviet border, initially filled with observations about landscape and culture. By December, the entries had devolved into survival notes, temperature readings, casualty counts, the color of frostbite at various stages. He wrote with a mechanical pencil because ink froze solid at -30. Weber had developed a habit of conversation with Hans during the retreat, finding in the mechanic a kind of genuine humanity that officers' school had trained him to suppress. They spoke of wives, of peacetime plans, of the garage Hans would open after the war, of the students Weber would teach. These conversations were lifelines, reminders that the world beyond frozen Russia still existed. Neither man voiced the obvious question, whether either of them would survive to reach that world. The column they marched with stretched for 2 kilometers, a snake of exhausted men following a road that was more suggestion than reality. The snow on the packed track was stained dark from thousands of boots. Abandoned equipment littered the shoulders. A truck lay on its side, cargo scattered, no one bothering to salvage anything, because carrying extra weight meant death. The wind came in gusts that staggered the weaker men. Some fell and did not rise. Their comrades kept walking. We can't stop for them. Hans spoke the words without emotion, a simple statement of terrible fact. Weber nodded, not trusting his voice. They had already stopped leaving markers for the dead. There were too many. The entire retreat was a mass grave stretching from Moscow's suburbs to wherever the Wehrmacht could establish a stable defensive line, if such a line was even possible. At the column's head rode the man who would transform Kholm from map reference to legend. General Major Theodor Scherer, 52 years old, a Prussian in the old mold, sat his horse with ramrod posture despite conditions that bent stronger men double. His face was a topographic map of military service. A scar ran from right temple to chin, souvenir of Verdun in 1916. His eyes were the pale blue of Baltic ice. He had survived the Great War's Western Front, had been wounded 3 times, had seen the German Empire collapse and rise again. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for this particular hell. Yet he adapted with the flexibility that separates competent officers from great ones. Scherer had been assigned command of the Kholm sector 72 hours prior, given verbal orders that amounted to, "Gather whoever you can, hold as long as possible, we'll try to send help." He had received these orders without protest, without questions about reinforcements or supplies, because he understood the situation's geometry. Someone had to stand somewhere, or the entire front would collapse into random violence. If that somewhere was Kholm, so be it. His assessment was coldly realistic. The forces gathering under his nominal command were not an army but a collection of survivors. Most were walking wounded. Many suffered from frostbite that would require amputation if they survived long enough to reach proper medical facilities. Almost none had winter equipment. The Wehrmacht's planners, confident in quick victory, had allocated winter gear only for occupation forces. Combat troops were expected to be in warm barracks by Christmas. Instead, they were dying in the snow wearing summer uniforms and hope. Yet Scherer saw something in these hollow-eyed men that military manuals never mentioned. They had endured what should have killed them and kept moving. That kind of stubborn vitality, properly directed, could be weaponized. His task was to provide direction before despair completed what the Red Army had started. The village of Kholm appeared through the snow like a mirage. Wooden buildings, barely distinguishable from the white landscape. The church steeple, its orthodox cross tilted from artillery damage, served as navigation point. 2,000 civilians remained in residence, mostly old people and children. The young men had been conscripted, the young women evacuated or fled. Those who remained watched the German column arrive with expressions of weary resignation. Another army, another occupation. The pattern was old even if the particulars varied. Hans and Weber entered Kholm on January 12, 1942, part of the initial wave of arrivals. The village was smaller than either had imagined, barely 20 streets arranged in rough grid pattern. Most structures were single-story wooden buildings with steep roofs designed to shed snow. A few stone buildings provided anchors. The church, the old Soviet administrative center, a warehouse complex near the river. The Lovett itself was frozen solid, 2 feet of ice over slow-moving water. Soviet forces could cross anywhere once they arrived in sufficient numbers. We're trapped already. We just don't know it yet. Weber spoke softly, standing in the village square, while Hans attempted to get feeling back into his fingers. Around them, soldiers were filing into buildings, claiming spaces, collapsing wherever shelter offered. No one was organizing billets. No one had orders. The army had dissolved into small groups of men seeking warmth and rest, the most basic human needs overwhelming military discipline. Then Scherer arrived and everything changed. He rode into the square on his exhausted horse, dismounted with deliberate care, and stood surveying the chaos with an expression that mixed assessment with determination. His aide attempted to help him, but Scherer waved him off. The old general stamped his feet to restore circulation, adjusted his coat, and began walking toward the largest building, the former Soviet headquarters. Every eye followed him, officers to me, all of them. Anyone commanding more than 10 men is an officer today. The voice carried despite wind and distance. Within 15 minutes, a motley assembly gathered in the basement of the headquarters building, lit by kerosene lamps that cast more shadow than light. 53 men, ranging from actual officers to sergeants promoted in the field to civilians with military experience. They stood in silence, waiting for this Prussian stranger to explain how they were supposed to survive what was coming. Scherer spread a map on a table that still bore Soviet propaganda posters. His finger traced the perimeter of Kholm, then the approaches, then the wider region. When he spoke, his voice was matter-of-fact, delivering catastrophe as if reporting weather. The Red Army is converging on this position from 3 directions. We have perhaps 3 days before they arrive in force. Once they do, we will be surrounded. There will be no retreat, no evacuation. We stay or we die in the attempt to leave. The room absorbed this information in silence. Someone coughed, the sound unnaturally loud. Weber, standing near the back, felt his stomach hollow out. Hans, beside him, gripped his rifle so tightly his knuckles went white beneath the rags. Scherer continued, now pointing to specific buildings on the map. We fortify every structure. Basements become shelters. Upper floors become firing positions. We establish overlapping fields of fire. We stockpile ammunition in distributed caches so one hit doesn't leave us defenseless. We organize medical facilities, supply depots, command posts. We do all of this in 3 days with exhausted men and no equipment. A captain from the 123rd Division, his face bearing burn scars from a flamethrower attack, raised his hand. Herr General, with respect, we have perhaps 500 able-bodied soldiers. Against an entire Soviet army, what chance do we have? Scherer looked at the captain with those ice-blue eyes. No chance. But we don't need chance. We need time. Every day we hold here is a day the Red Army cannot exploit its breakthrough. Every Soviet soldier tied down besieging us is a soldier not attacking elsewhere. We are not here to win. We are here to not lose. And as long as we breathe, we have not lost. The logic was impeccable and horrible. They were being asked to sacrifice themselves as a delaying action, a human barricade against the Soviet tide. Yet something in Scherer's demeanor, the calm acceptance, the absolute lack of theatrics, lent his words weight that patriotic speeches could never achieve. He was not sending them to die for abstractions. He was asking them to do an impossible job because it needed doing. Weber understood in that moment why men followed commanders into hopeless situations, not from blind obedience but from the desire to measure themselves against impossible standards, to discover whether they could endure what they believed would break them. Scherer was offering a test, and every man in that basement knew they would take it. The next 3 days transformed Kholm from village to fortress through effort that bordered on superhuman. Engineers, the few who remained, organized work parties that labored around the clock despite temperatures that dropped to -35. Soldiers who could barely walk found strength to dig trenches through frozen earth, hacking with pickaxes because the ground was too hard for shovels. Every house became a defensive position, windows converted to firing ports, doors reinforced with furniture and frozen earth. Hans discovered that his mechanical skills translated to improvisation. He directed teams in creating makeshift heating systems from ammunition cans, ventilation shafts from stovepipe, firing positions from overturned carts and sandbags filled with snow. The work kept him moving, kept his blood circulating, prevented the cold from claiming fingers and toes. He slept in 2-hour increments, standing up, rifle in hand, because lying down meant risking never getting up again. Weber was assigned to artillery coordination despite having only theoretical knowledge of fire support. The handful of artillery pieces that had made it to Kholm, 3 105mm howitzers, 5 80mm mortars, all with dangerously low ammunition stocks, were positioned in cellars with firing angles calculated to cover the main approaches. Weber plotted firing solutions with a mechanical pencil and mathematical training from his teaching days, converting landscape into geometry, buildings into angles of deflection. The civilian population reacted to this militarization with resignation. Some helped, carrying materials or pointing out structural weaknesses in buildings. Others simply withdrew into basements and waited. One old man, Dmitri, 70 years old with a beard that reached his chest, approached Hans while he was reinforcing a wall with frozen logs. "You will die here, German." "We all will." Hans paused in his work, looked at the old man. "Maybe, probably, but not today." Dmitri nodded as if this answer satisfied some internal question. He disappeared into his house and returned with a bundle of rags and a small girl, perhaps 8 years old, with enormous dark eyes. "This is Katya, my granddaughter. When the fighting starts, she will need to hide. I am too old to protect her. You, however, might survive long enough." Hans looked at the child, at Dmitri, at the absurdity of being asked by a Russian civilian to protect a Russian child from the Russian army. Yet the request made a kind of sense that transcended nationality. Dmitri was not asking for mercy from the Germans. He was gambling that self-interest would keep Hans alive longer than principle, and that the child could shelter in that self-interest's shadow. "I'll do what I can." The girl reached into her coat and produced a small piece of black bread, broke it in half, offered one portion to Hans. The gesture was so unexpected, so generous given the universal hunger, that Hans felt something crack inside his chest. He took the bread, shared it with the girl, and for a moment the war receded into background noise. On January 21st, the first Soviet scouts appeared in the forests surrounding Kholm. Small patrols, testing defenses, mapping positions, withdrawing before they could be engaged. Scherer ordered his own patrols out to probe enemy strength and returned with reports that drained what little optimism remained. Multiple divisions assembling, armor moving into position, artillery parks being established. The Soviet intent was not just to take Kholm, but to obliterate it. January 24th brought the first artillery shells, ranging shots that fell on the village's eastern edge. One struck a warehouse, another the church courtyard. The explosion sent snow geysering into the air, the concussive force felt in basements 3 blocks away. Scherer used these shots to calibrate his own defensive artillery, returning fire not to destroy, but to signal that Kholm would resist. The Soviets got the message and began bringing up heavier guns. By January 25th, the noose was visible even to untrained eyes. Soviet positions ringed Kholm in a semicircle from north to south, leaving only a narrow corridor open to the west. That corridor was the final lifeline, a snowpacked trail barely wide enough for a single truck. Supply convoys attempted to use it despite constant artillery harassment. Some made it through. Most did not. The trail became littered with burned vehicles and scattered cargo, a breadcrumb path of failed logistics. Scherer convened another meeting on the evening of January 25th. The same basement, fewer lamps because kerosene was running low. The assembled officers looked worse than 3 days prior, faces hollowed by exhaustion and inadequate rations. Scherer stood before his map, which now showed red markers almost completely encircling the blue marker labeled Kholm. Tomorrow they will close the ring. The last bridge over the Lovat is being prepared for demolition by Soviet sappers. Once it goes, we are completely isolated. Air resupply may be attempted, weather permitting, but we should assume we're on our own. A young lieutenant, barely 20, asked the question everyone was thinking. For how long, sir? How long do we need to hold? Scherer's expression did not change. Until we are relieved or until we are dead. Those are the only timelines that matter. The meeting dispersed in silence. Hans and Weber walked together through streets that now felt claustrophobic despite the open sky. Defensive positions watched from every window. Machine gun nests occupied intersections. The village had transformed into a warren of prepared kill zones. Weber produced 2 cigarettes. Actual tobacco, not the sawdust mixture that passed for smokes. He had been saving them, unsure for what occasion. This moment seemed appropriate. They lit the cigarettes from a burning ember, cupping hands against the wind. You ever think about what we'll tell people if we survive? Hans drew smoke deep, let it warm his lungs before exhaling a white cloud that disappeared into the larger whiteness. I think about my daughter, whether she'll remember me, whether I'll recognize her when I get back. Weber nodded. I think about my students. How I'll explain this. How you teach history after you've lived it. They finished their cigarettes in silence, dropped the butts into snow that hissed and melted into tiny craters. Around them, Kholm settled into its final night of relative peace. Men checked weapons, redistributed ammunition, wrote letters that would never be sent. Some prayed. Others slept the sleep of exhaustion so deep it resembled death. At 4:17 on the morning of January 26, 1942, the sound reached into every corner of Kholm and dragged men from whatever rest they had found. Not the whistle of incoming artillery, something deeper, more final. An explosion so massive it seemed to originate from the Earth's core, rolling thunder that rattled windows and collapsed sections of damaged buildings. Weber was on watch in the church tower when it happened. The flash lit the western horizon orange for 3 full seconds. Then the sound arrived, a physical force that made the stone structure vibrate. He grabbed the field telephone, cranked the handle frantically. The bridge is gone. Across Kholm, officers and soldiers processed this information with the speed of men who had been expecting it, yet dreading its confirmation. Scherer, asleep in full uniform on the floor of his headquarters, opened his eyes and spoke to the aide who burst into the room. And so it begins. Sound assembly. All positions manned. Hans emerged from the basement shelter, where he had been sleeping with 20 other men, weapon in hand, moving on autopilot toward his assigned position at a barricade on Bolshaya Street. The cold hit him like a physical blow after the relative warmth of the packed shelter. Above, the sky was beginning its grudging transition from black to gray. Not dawn, just less dark. Soviet artillery opened fire at 5:30, systematic bombardment of Kholm's perimeter. Not the ranging shots of previous days, but sustained fire designed to suppress and demoralize. Shells walked up and down the streets, searching for targets. A house on the northern edge took a direct hit, walls exploding outward in a spray of timber and plaster. Men who had been sleeping inside had no chance to scream. By 8 the bombardment ceased, replaced by a silence more menacing than the thunder. In that silence, observers reported movement on all sides. Infantry in white camouflage, dozens of them, then hundreds, emerging from tree lines and taking positions in the snow. Armor was being brought forward, T-34s grinding through drifts, turrets traversing to acquire targets. The encirclement was complete. Kholm had become an island of 5,500 souls in a sea of enemies who outnumbered them 10 to 1. Scherer toured the defenses on foot, refusing a vehicle despite the danger from snipers who were already active. He stopped at each position, spoke briefly with the defenders, asked about ammunition status, checked fields of fire. His presence was a statement. If the general exposed himself to the same risks as the privates, the general believed survival was possible. Men drew strength from this illogic. At Hans's barricade, Scherer paused longer than elsewhere. He studied the improvised fortifications, the overlapping positions, the ammunition distribution. Then he looked directly at Hans, seeming to take the measure of the young mechanic in greatcoat and rags. Good work here. When they come, they'll pay for every meter. Hans managed a nod, not trusting his voice. Scherer moved on, leaving behind the faint impression that maybe, impossibly, they might endure what was coming. The morning dragged into afternoon without attack. Soviet forces continued to mass, artillery pieces continued to arrive, but the assault itself was delayed. Weber, watching from his command post, understood the psychology. Let the defenders stew in their fear. Let them imagine what is coming. Break them mentally before breaking them physically. It was sound doctrine applied with Russian patience. As twilight approached, bringing with it temperatures that would drop below -40, Scherer gathered his senior staff for what would be the last organized meeting before chaos descended. The map on the wall now showed Kholm as a tiny island of blue, completely surrounded by red. Every road was cut, every trail blocked. The frozen river, which might have provided an escape route, was watched by Soviet machine gun positions every 100 meters. Gentlemen, we are now officially besieged. The situation could not be clearer. The enemy controls everything beyond our perimeter. We control approximately 1.8 square kilometers of frozen Russia. Supplies are sufficient for 30 days on reduced rations. Ammunition for 15 days of heavy combat. Medical supplies are already inadequate. Casualty evacuation is impossible. Reinforcement is unlikely. He paused, letting the catalog of disadvantages sink in. Then his voice hardened, acquiring an edge that had been absent before. But understand this. As long as one of us breathes, Kholm does not fall. Not to artillery, not to assault, not to cold or hunger or fear. We hold because holding is what remains when all other options are exhausted. You will communicate this to your men, not as hope, but as fact. We are here. We stay here. Everything else is enemy propaganda. The officers filed out, returning to their positions as darkness completed its conquest of the day. Hans and Weber stood together on a street corner, breathing clouds of vapor, watching the last light fade from the western sky. In the distance, barely visible through the murk, Soviet campfires began to appear. Dozens, then hundreds, a necklace of flame encircling Kholm's throat. Weber's voice was barely a whisper. We're truly alone now. Hans didn't respond immediately. When he did, his words carried a conviction that surprised even himself. Not alone. We have each other. We have 5,000 others. As long as that's true, we have a chance. Somewhere in the darkness, a soldier began to sing. A folk song from Bavaria, soft and melancholy. Others joined, voices blending in harmony that defied the circumstance. The song drifted across frozen streets, into shelters where men huddled against the cold, out into the night where it died against the wind. For 3 minutes, Kholm was not a fortress, but a community, bound by something stronger than military discipline. The singing stopped. Silence returned, heavy with anticipation. In his headquarters basement, Scherer stood before the map, alone, studying the dispositions with the concentration of a chess master facing an impossible position. Outside, the temperature dropped another degree. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of distant fires and the promise of violence. At 11:47 that night, a runner burst into Weber's command post, face white with something beyond cold. Sir, radio intercept. Soviet frequencies. They're laughing. And then orders. Direct translation. Destroy the fascist viper in Kholm. Untold fascistskую gadюку в Kholmi. Weber thanked the runner, dismissed him, and sat alone in the darkness. The words echoed in his mind, stripped of rhetoric, reduced to pure intent. The Soviets were not coming to capture Kholm. They were coming to annihilate it. Every man, every structure, every trace that Germans had ever been there. He opened his diary, found the next blank page, wrote by feel because his pencil had frozen and would not mark the paper. He wrote anyway, the gesture more important than the result. January 26, 1942. The siege is complete. Kholm is now an island of ice, blood, and steel, surrounded by a red ocean that grows larger by the hour. We number 5,500. They number perhaps 50,000. We have food for 30 days. They can starve us for 300. We have ammunition for 15 days of heavy fighting. They have unlimited shells. He paused, pencil hovering over paper that remained blank because the lead would not transfer in the cold. Then he spoke aloud to the empty room, to himself, to whatever God might be listening. This is the siege that should not be survived, and yet we will try. God help us. We will try. Across Kholm, men settled into positions they would occupy for the next 100 days, though none yet understood the timescale of their imprisonment. They checked weapons one final time, redistributed ammunition, positioned grenades within arm's reach. Some wrote final letters, others simply stared into darkness, conserving strength for what dawn would bring. In a basement on Pushkinskaya Street, little Katya slept curled against her grandfather Dmitri, unaware that tomorrow the world above would transform into hell. Hans, on guard duty 50 meters away, thought of the child, of his own daughter he had never met, of all the children who deserve better than to be born into this frozen nightmare. He tightened his grip on his rifle and waited. Midnight passed, then 1 o'clock, then 2. The darkness before dawn, the coldest part of any winter night, settled over Kholm like a burial shroud. The Soviet campfires dimmed, but did not die. Artillery crews made final preparations. Infantry checked weapons. Assault groups received their orders. All around the tiny German pocket, 40,000 men prepared to crush 5,000. But in Kholm itself, something unexpected was taking root. Not hope. Hope was a luxury for people with futures. This was simpler and more powerful. Determination. The stubborn refusal to surrender that defines humanity at its most basic level. 5,500 souls, German and Russian, soldier and civilian, wounded and whole, united by geography and circumstance, into a single organism with one imperative: survive one more day. The church bell, damaged but functional, chimed 3 times. The sound carried across frozen streets, into basements, out to the perimeter positions. 3 in the morning, 4 hours until dawn. 4 hours until the Soviet artillery would begin its work in earnest. 4 hours left of peace, however cold and frightened that peace might be. Scherer, still awake in his headquarters, heard the bell and allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had fought in the Great War, had survived Verdun, where hundreds of thousands died for meters of churned mud. He had seen what modern warfare could do to human bodies and human minds. But this Kholm felt different. At Verdun, both sides had been equally miserable, equally frozen in their trenches. Here the balance was asymmetric. His men were outnumbered, outgunned, isolated in hostile territory, facing an enemy fighting for their homeland. By every military calculation, Kholm should fall in days. Yet Scherer had learned that military calculations often failed to account for the variable that mattered most: human stubbornness. And these men, exhausted and frozen and hungry as they were, possessed that quality in abundance. They had survived the retreat from Moscow. They had endured temperatures that killed by the thousands. They were still here. As long as that remained true, anything was possible. He walked to the window, looked out at his domain. Kholm, barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness, a collection of shapes and shadows that would soon become a battlefield. Somewhere in those shadows, Hans Cooper stood guard, thinking of his daughter. Karl Weber sat in his command post, unable to write because his pencil refused to mark frozen paper. Old Dmitri held his granddaughter, wondering if either would survive the week, and 4,000 others, each with their own fears and hopes and stubborn determination to see another dawn. The bell chimed again. 3:30. The darkness was absolute now, the cold at its worst. Men stamped feet, blew on hands, did what humans have always done in the face of cold and death. They endured. And in that endurance, in that simple refusal to stop, lay the seed of everything that would follow. Because Kholm would not fall. Not tomorrow, not in a week, not in a month. The siege that should have ended in days would stretch into 3 months of frozen hell. Thousands would die. The village itself would be destroyed, reduced to rubble and memory. But the defenders would hold day after impossible day, writing a story of survival that defied every reasonable expectation. That story began now, in the frozen darkness before dawn, with exhausted men in inadequate clothing, preparing to resist forces that should have annihilated them. It began with a Prussian general who refused to accept defeat, with a mechanic from Hamburg who had never wanted to be a soldier, with a history teacher who was learning that living history was nothing like teaching it, with an old Russian man and a little girl who had no choice but to shelter in the storm these armies had created. The siege began with that simple arithmetic: 5,500 against 50,000. 30 days of food versus unlimited time. 15 days of ammunition versus limitless shells. And one absolute conviction that transcended all calculation: we are still here. And while we remain, Kholm stands. The darkness began its reluctant retreat toward dawn. The Soviet artillery crews received their final orders. Infantry assault groups moved into jumping-off positions. Tank engines coughed to life, metal shrieking in the cold. Around Kholm's perimeter, 5,500 souls took deep breaths, checked weapons, and prepared themselves for what no training could truly prepare them for. The moment when the mathematics of survival would be tested against the physics of modern war. And somewhere in that frozen darkness, history was already beginning to whisper its judgment. This place, this forgotten village on a frozen river, would be remembered long after the empires that created this conflict had turned to dust. Not for victory, because there would be no victory. Not for heroism, because heroism was too grand a word for what would happen here. But for something simpler and more profound: the capacity of human beings to endure what should have destroyed them, to survive what should have been unsurvivable, to hold when every rational calculation demanded surrender. Kholm, the island in the storm, the pocket that refused to collapse, the siege that should not have been survived. It was about to begin. Dawn arrived as a theory rather than reality, the sun unable to pierce clouds that hung low enough to touch the ruined buildings. At 5:48 on the morning of January 27th, hell announced itself with mathematics. 100 artillery pieces firing simultaneously across a front of less than 2 kilometers. The sound was not sound, but physical force. Air molecules compressed into hammers that struck eardrums and internal organs with equal brutality. Weber had been standing in the church tower when the bombardment began, field telephone in one hand, the other braced against stone that immediately began to vibrate. The first shells impacted on Kholm's eastern perimeter, orange flowers blooming in the gray morning. Then the western edge, then the center. The Soviets were not targeting specific positions. They were erasing the village from existence. 122mm howitzers sent shells on flat trajectories that punched through walls before exploding. 152mm guns fired from positions 3 kilometers distant, their projectiles arriving with whistles that gave 1 second of warning before detonation. Mortars dropped their loads almost vertically, falling into streets and courtyards where they fragmented into thousands of steel shards. In 47 minutes, 1,800 shells fell on an area smaller than most city parks. A house on Bolshaya Street, reinforced 3 days prior by Hans and his team, took a direct hit from a 152mm round. The structure didn't collapse so much as disintegrate, walls atomizing into splinters and dust. 12 men had been sheltering in the basement. The explosion sealed them beneath rubble that would require days to excavate. No one had days. The men remained entombed, their screams audible to nearby positions for 6 hours before silence claimed them. The Orthodox church bell, already damaged, began to ring on its own. Each nearby explosion set it vibrating, producing a mournful toll that echoed across Kholm with the rhythm of a funeral dirge. Weber watched it swing in the tower 20 meters below his position, metal striking metal in counterpoint to artillery concussions. Men would later call it the death bell, and the name fit perfectly. It rang for the dying and would continue ringing for months. When the bombardment ceased at 6:35, the silence felt like deafness. Men emerged from shelters with blood running from their ears. The capillaries burst by overpressure. The village had been transformed. Entire blocks that had stood intact now resembled archaeological ruins. Streets were cratered, some holes deep enough to hide a man. The smell of high explosive mixed with pulverized masonry created a fog that burned lungs and eyes. Weber descended from the tower on legs that barely supported him. His entire body felt bruised from the inside out, muscles aching from tension and concussive force. At the tower's base, he found two sentries. One was conscious but staring at nothing, shell-shocked into catatonia. The other had bled out from both ears, dead without a visible wound. Then the real attack began. From the northern tree line where frost-covered pines stood like ghostly sentinels, shapes materialized. White against white, Soviet infantry in winter camouflage moving at a pace that seemed impossible in the snow. They came without war cries initially, without the "Ura" that German soldiers had learned to fear. They simply came, a tide of armed men pouring toward defensive positions that were still recovering from the bombardment. The 391st Siberian Rifle Division led the assault, men from Yakutia and Buryatia, who had been born to cold that would kill Europeans in minutes. Their padded coats were pristine white. Their faces, wrapped in scarves against the -40 temperature, showed only eyes that held no mercy. Behind them came penal companies. Convicts promised redemption through blood. These men carried no winter clothing, advancing in summer uniforms, because their commanders considered them expendable. They would die regardless. Better they died drawing German fire than consuming Soviet rations. Machine guns opened fire from Kholm's perimeter, the MG-34s producing their characteristic sound, like fabric tearing at industrial speed. The noise was continuous, overwhelming, punctuated by the deeper bark of rifles and the hollow thump of stick grenades. The first rank of Soviet infantry went down as if choreographed, men dropping into snow that immediately stained red. But more came behind them, stepping over bodies, sometimes stepping on bodies, their momentum carrying them forward through fire that should have stopped any attack. Hans Cooper was at his barricade on the northern approach when the assault reached his position. 300 meters of open ground separated Soviet jumping-off points from German defenses. The machine gunner to Hans's right fired in disciplined bursts, barrel already glowing despite the cold. The gunner's loader fed belts, hands moving with the mechanical precision of someone who had transcended fear into pure function. Hans fired his MP-40 in short bursts, not aiming at individuals but at the mass, because targeting individuals in that swarm seemed pointless. At 200 meters, the Siberians began running, their voices finally finding release. "Za Rodinu! Za Stalina!" The words came like incantation, transforming the attack into something beyond military operation. This was crusade, vengeance, purification. Every Soviet soldier advancing had seen what the Wehrmacht had done during the summer offensive. Burned villages, executed partisans, populations starved. Now they returned payment with interest. At 100 meters, the German fire reached its peak intensity. Men who had been conserving ammunition now fired as fast as weapons allowed. Grenades arced through the air. The machine guns switched to continuous fire. Barrels overheating despite the cold. The metal warping from sustained use. Soviet casualties became carpet, layers of dead and dying covering the snow in patterns that resembled abstract art rendered in red and white. But numbers tell. For every Soviet who fell, 3 more advanced. Some leapt over the barricades before defenders could react, landing in positions designed to keep enemies out, but equally effective at trapping occupants in. Hand-to-hand combat erupted in a dozen places simultaneously. Bayonets found flesh, rifle butts crushed skulls. Men wrestled in snow-stained dark, fighting with the desperation of animals in traps. Hans's MP-40 emptied its magazine. He reached for another, found none remaining. The soldier beside him went down with a bayonet in his throat, the Soviet wielding it, already turning toward Hans. No time for thought. Hans grabbed his entrenching tool, the short-handled shovel every soldier carried, and swung with all the strength terror provides. The sharpened edge caught the Soviet soldier in the temple. The man dropped. Another appeared. Hans swung again. The shovel connected with a jaw-shattering bone. A third Soviet came over the barricade. This one carried a PPSH submachine gun, but at this range it was club. Hans ducked the swing, drove the shovel's point into the man's abdomen, twisted. The Soviet screamed and fell backward. For 90 seconds, Hans Cooper fought with the entrenching tool. A mechanic from Hamburg transformed into something primal. He killed 3 men in that minute and a half, wounded 2 others, held the barricade alone while the defenders on either side engaged their own desperate struggles. Then a 4th Soviet soldier came from his blind side, bayonet extended. Hans turned too late. The blade entered just below his ribs, angled upward, found his lung. He felt the impact more than pain, a shocking coldness spreading through his chest. His hands released the shovel, his knees folded. The last thing he saw was sky, gray and indifferent. The Soviet who killed him fell seconds later to rifle fire from a German reinforcement team. The soldier beside Hans, a Saxon named Müller, dragged Hans backward into partial cover, but the wound was mortal. Blood came from Hans's mouth, bright red and frothing. Müller held him as he died, which took 3 minutes. Hans's final words were unintelligible, lost in the blood that filled his throat. His right hand clutched something in his coat pocket. The letter, the photograph, his wife, his daughter. The assault broke at 7:30, Soviet forces retreating in disorder after penetrating German lines in 4 places, but failing to exploit any breakthrough. They left behind more than 1,000 casualties scattered across the snow, some dead, many wounded and freezing. German defensive doctrine prohibited rescue of enemy wounded. The men lay where they fell, crying for help in Russian that meant nothing to defenders who had their own casualties to address. By nightfall, the voices stopped. The cold had finished what bullets began. Weber learned of Hans's death at 8 Waring, the information delivered by a runner who had witnessed the final moments. He absorbed the news without visible reaction, filed it in the mental compartment where all losses were stored because dwelling meant breaking. But after the runner left, Weber walked to the position where Hans had died. The body had been moved to a collection point, a courtyard where the frozen dead were stacked like cordwood because burial was impossible. Weber found Hans in the 3rd row, his face peaceful despite the violent death, frost already forming on his eyelashes. The letter was still in Hans's pocket. Weber extracted it carefully, unfolded paper that crackled with cold. Read words written by a woman who would never know her husband's fate. The photograph fell out, showing mother and infant, both smiling. Weber stared at the image for a long moment, this evidence of a world beyond Kholm, proof that humanity continued somewhere despite everything happening here. He folded the letter, placed it and the photograph in his own coat. If he survived, he would find Hans's wife. Give her these fragments. Tell her that her husband died fighting, which was truth, though what purpose that truth served Weber could not imagine. January 28th brought the realization that the noose was tightening from survival challenge to death grip. Aerial reconnaissance conducted by a brave or foolish Luftwaffe pilot in a Fieseler Stork confirmed what observers on the ground suspected. The perimeter had shrunk. Soviet forces now occupied positions that had been German-held 2 days prior. The pocket measured 1,800 meters east to west, 1,200 meters north to south, an area smaller than many farms, holding 5,500 increasingly desperate souls. The last functional radio, a battered, torn .efu.b device powered by a hand-cranked generator, crackled to life at 11 Howin with a transmission from Army Group North headquarters. The signal was weak, breaking up every few words, but the message was clear enough. Kholm surrounded all sides. Hold position. Luftwaffe will attempt resupply. Courage, then static. The operator cranked harder, achieving nothing but mechanical grinding. The antenna had been damaged by shrapnel during the morning bombardment. Repairs were attempted but failed. Kholm's last voice to the outside world went silent. The isolation was now absolute. No one could hear their calls for help. No one could tell them how long they needed to endure. They existed in a bubble of present tense, with only the immediate moment mattering. Scherer convened another conference in the basement that served as headquarters. Fewer officers attended. Some had been killed in the previous day's fighting. Others commanded positions too critical to leave. Those who came bore faces that had aged years and days, eyes sunken, skin tight over bones already prominent from inadequate rations. Scherer spread the updated map, red markers showing Soviet positions now reaching into what had been Kholm's interior. Gentlemen, our current inventory. Ammunition sufficient for 12 days of combat at current expenditure rate. Food for 32 days on minimum rations of 125 grams bread, 1/7 can of meat per man per day. Water from melted snow only. Medical supplies critically low. Morphine exhausted. Sulfa drugs nearly gone. Bandages being reused. 14 horses remain alive. When they die, we eat them. Questions? A captain from the 218th Regiment raised his hand. The civilians, sir. 800 mouths we cannot feed. Permission to... No. Scherer's voice cut like a blade. We do not solve supply problems by creating atrocities. Civilians receive half military rations. Children receive what their mothers can steal. This is not optimal. It is what we have. The captain sat back, expression unreadable. Around the room, other officers processed this command. Some nodded approval. Others calculated the mathematics. 800 civilians consuming food that could extend the soldier's survival by days or weeks. But Scherer had spoken, and his authority derived not from rank alone, but from the respect he commanded through example. If he said civilians lived, civilians lived. That afternoon brought an incident that crystallized the moral compromises survival demanded. A group of 10 Russian civilians, mostly women and children, attempted to leave Kholm. They gathered near the western perimeter, carrying bundles of possessions, heading for what they believed was still an open corridor to German-held territory. They were wrong. The corridor had been cut the previous night. What lay west was Soviet-controlled forest. A German sentry, an 18-year-old conscript from the Rhineland named Klaus, spotted them and called for them to stop. They either did not hear or did not comprehend. He fired a warning shot. They began running. Soviet positions 800 meters distant opened fire with machine guns, the burst accurate despite the range. 5 civilians fell immediately. The others reversed course, dragging 2 wounded, leaving 3 dead in the snow. One of the wounded was a woman in her 40s, her shawl soaked with blood from a bullet through her shoulder. She crawled to Klaus's position, pulled herself to her knees before him, spoke in Russian mixed with broken German. Ne ubivai dete, golod, don't kill children. Hunger. Klaus, who had never killed anyone before being conscripted 8 months prior, stared at this woman begging for her children's lives, and something fundamental broke inside him. He lowered his rifle, turned his face away, and wept. Not quiet tears, but racking sobs that shook his entire frame. The woman remained kneeling, uncertain whether this was mercy or prelude to execution. Eventually, Klaus gestured for her to go, unable to speak. She limped away, supporting a child whose feet were wrapped in rags, disappearing into the ruins. Food rationing began that evening. Every soldier received his portion, 125 grams of black bread so stale it had to be softened with snow before eating. 1 spoonful of canned meat, the fat congealed into white wax that tasted of nothing. 1 cup of coffee made from roasted grain that bore no relationship to actual coffee except color. This was breakfast, lunch, and dinner combined. Men tried to make it last, eating in tiny bites, but hunger was not fooled by psychological tricks. Civilians received half this amount. Children officially received half the civilian portion. In practice, mothers shared their food with their children, meaning the women were starving fastest. Within 3 days, the first cases of malnutrition-induced hallucinations appeared. A woman reported seeing her husband, dead since summer, walking through the village. An old man insisted he smelled baking bread, following the phantom scent for hours before collapsing from exhaustion. The cold, which had been merely terrible, became actively homicidal. On the night of February 1st, the thermometer, one of 3 remaining functional instruments in Kholm, registered minus 48 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, exposed flesh froze in under 60 seconds. Exhaled breath formed ice crystals that hung in the air. Alcohol thermometers exploded from the contraction of their liquid. Men urinated into containers because going outside meant risking genital frostbite, and those containers froze solid within minutes. Frostbite progressed through Kholm's garrison like a plague, selecting victims with random cruelty. Soldiers who had endured weeks of cold suddenly discovered fingers or toes that had lost all sensation. The progression was predictable. First, the skin turned waxy white, then gray, then black. Once black, the tissue was dead. Amputation became the only treatment, and amputation under current conditions meant infection, gangrene, death. Dr. Ernst Klest, one of two remaining physicians in Kholm, performed surgery in a basement converted to operating theater. The room was lit by kerosene lamps that provided barely enough light to see the patient. Heat came from a wood-burning stove that created temperature gradients. Near the stove, almost warm, 2 meters away below freezing. Klest worked wearing gloves with the fingers cut off, trying to maintain enough dexterity to handle instruments while preventing his own hands from freezing. The operating table was a door laid across sawhorses. Anesthesia consisted of whatever alcohol remained in Kholm's supplies, which was not much. When alcohol ran out, Klest used what remained of the morphine supply. When morphine was exhausted, patients received nothing. The surgery began with a blow to the head from a rifle butt, rendering them unconscious for perhaps 90 seconds. This was sufficient time to amputate a finger. For larger operations, patients were simply held down by 4 soldiers while Klest worked as fast as possible. The saw was designed for cutting wood, but served for bone after being heated over the stove. Klest made his cuts, the sound of steel on bone audible throughout the basement. Patients who were conscious screamed. Those who were unconscious woke screaming. The amputated limbs went into a barrel in the corner, freezing solid immediately, creating a macabre sculpture of separated body parts. Cauterization was achieved with iron rods heated until they glowed. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the smell of excrement. Patients invariably voided their bowels from pain and shock, and the smell of unwashed bodies, creating an atmosphere so foul that even hardened soldiers vomited upon entering. Klest worked 16-hour days, sleeping in 2-hour blocks, eating nothing because his hands needed to be steady, and food made him drowsy. On February 3rd, his most difficult case arrived. Lieutenant Joachim von Kleist, 26 years old, a distant cousin through the extended Prussian aristocratic family networks that meant everything before the war and nothing now. Both of Joachim's feet were black to the ankles, the flesh hard as stone, already beginning to smell of putrefaction despite the cold. Gangrene had set in. Without amputation, he would die within days as the infection spread. Joachim was conscious, lucid, and resigned. He looked at his cousin with eyes that held no hope. "Do it quickly, Ernst. I would prefer to die with my boots on, as a soldier should, but I understand that's not possible. Just quickly." Klest prepared his instruments, such as they were: the saw, the cauterizing iron, bandages that had been used before, washed in melted snow, and frozen until needed again. 2 soldiers stood ready to hold Joachim down. A third had prepared the rifle butt for the knockout blow. Joachim raised a hand. "Wait, I would like to sing. The old hymn. You remember?" Ernst nodded. The Prussian infantry hymn, taught to both of them as boys in the gymnasium, back when military service was adventure rather than atrocity. He nodded to the soldiers to wait. Joachim began to sing, his voice surprisingly strong, the German words echoing off stone walls. "Gott mit uns, Gott mit uns." God with us, the soldier's prayer sung for 300 years. The soldier swung the rifle butt. It connected with Joachim's temple, and he dropped into unconsciousness mid-verse, the song cutting off with surgical precision. Klest made his first cut below the knee, working quickly, the saw moving through flesh and bone with practiced efficiency. Blood welled, but not as much as normal. The cold and the damaged circulation meant reduced bleeding. He completed the first leg in 4 minutes, applied the cauterizing iron, smelled the sizzle of cooked meat. Joachim remained unconscious throughout. The second leg took 3 minutes. Klest was working faster now, racing against the moment when his patient would wake. He finished the cut, applied the iron, began wrapping the stumps in bandages. Joachim's eyes opened. For 3 seconds he stared at the ceiling, expression confused. Then awareness returned, and with it pain so intense his back arched, pulling against the soldiers holding him. He managed a single scream before his heart stopped. Just stopped, as if deciding that continuing was more effort than it was worth. Kless tried resuscitation, pounding on Joachim's chest, breathing into his mouth, achieving nothing. After 5 minutes, he stepped back, wiped his hands on a rag already stiff with frozen blood. The soldiers released the corpse, which remained on the table, another addition to the death pile accumulating in the courtyard. Ernst stood motionless, staring at his cousin's face, peaceful now in death, and wondered how many more operations he would perform before joining the dead himself. That night, the temperature remained at -45. Soldiers in defensive positions faced a choice: huddle together for warmth or maintain proper spacing for defensive purposes. Most chose warmth, accepting the risk that a single artillery shell could kill an entire group. 4 men pressed together generated enough heat to stave off hypothermia, their combined body warmth creating a microclimate that meant survival. Conversations in these huddles were minimal. Men conserved energy, drifting in and out of exhausted sleep, taking turns on guard duty that meant staying awake more than actually watching. Weber spent the night in such a group, pressed against 3 other soldiers in a basement on Sovetskaya Street. One of the men, an Austrian corporal, barely 19, shivered continuously despite the shared warmth. Weber removed his own coat, draped it over the boy. "You need it more. I've got enough mass to survive another night." The boy looked at Weber with gratitude so profound it was embarrassing. "Thank you, Herr Leutnant. My mother, she always said angels look after people. Maybe you're an angel." Weber almost laughed. "If I'm an angel, we're all in more trouble than I thought. Now sleep. Tomorrow will be worse." February 3rd brought the sound that transformed despair into something approaching hope, if hope could exist in -40-degree hell. At 11:18, observers heard it first as a distant hum that could have been wind or Soviet vehicles or hallucination. Then the hum resolved into engine noise, rhythmic and mechanical. A sentry in the damaged church steeple shouted words that brought every defender into the streets despite sniper danger. Flugzeug, German planes. 12 Junkers U-52 transport aircraft appeared from the west, flying low to avoid the worst of Soviet anti-aircraft fire. Their 3 engines laboring in the thin, cold air. Ice covered their wings and fuselages, accumulated despite aircrew's efforts to scrape it clear. One aircraft trailed black smoke from its left engine. They came anyway, ungainly and slow, the most beautiful sight Kholm's defenders had seen in 2 weeks. Soviet 37mm and 76.2mm anti-aircraft batteries opened fire immediately. The sky filled with black puffs of exploding shells, creating a maze of death that the transports had to navigate. Tracer rounds rose like swarms of orange insects, seeking metal targets. The Ju-52s began dropping their cargo from 800 meters, high enough to make accuracy impossible, but low enough that some containers would land inside the perimeter. The first containers fell with white parachutes that opened like flowers against the gray sky. Others were simply thrown out, burlap sacks without parachutes that plummeted and hit the snow with impacts that buried them halfway. Men poured from defensive positions, running toward the falling supplies despite machine gun fire from Soviet lines. Recovery teams organized spontaneously, groups of 20 or 30 soldiers racing across open ground with shovels and ropes. A container fell onto Bolshaya Street, landing with enough force to crater the frozen surface. Soldiers surrounded it, tore open the crate with bayonets in bare hands. Inside, 400 kilograms of black bread, frozen so hard it could break teeth. Men began licking the bread immediately, too hungry to wait, tears streaming down faces burned by cold and sun. Another container landed 400 meters beyond German lines in Soviet-controlled territory. A dozen Germans ran after it, abandoning cover, sprinting through snow that reached their thighs. Soviet machine guns tracked them, fire disciplined and accurate. 5 men fell before reaching the container. The remaining 7 grabbed it, began dragging it back. 2 more died in the return journey, their bodies left behind because stopping meant everyone died. The 5 survivors hauled the container into German lines, leaving a trail of red droplets in the snow. Inside, 98K ammunition, egg grenades, and 2,000 Coca-Cola chocolate bars. The Wehrmacht's standard issue energy ration containing caffeine and pure sugar. Gefreiter Fritz Kurler, a signalman from Frankfurt, found a container that had landed alone, 250 meters from the defensive perimeter. He ran to it while Soviet snipers bracketed his position, bullets kicking up snow around his boots. He reached the container, dropped behind it for cover, pried it open with his bayonet. His hands trembled as he pulled back the canvas wrapping, revealing the contents. Maps. 125,000 topographic maps of the Leningrad region, scale 125,000, printed on expensive paper, beautifully detailed. No food, no ammunition, no medical supplies. Just maps of terrain the defenders of Kholm would never see because they would die here before this siege ended. Fritz sat in the snow behind his container of worthless paper, holding one map against his chest, and began to laugh. The laugh was hollow, broken, the sound of a mind beginning to fracture. It transformed into tears, then back to laughter, then to screaming. Two comrades reached him, dragged him back to German lines while he clutched the map like a child with a comfort blanket. They left the remaining 199 maps for the Soviets. In total, the 12 aircraft managed to drop cargo. 7 returned to base. 5 were shot down or disappeared into the clouds trailing smoke, their crews probably dead before impact. What reached Kholm's defenders? 4,800 kilograms of bread, 1,200 kilograms of canned meat, 800 kilograms of fat, 120,000 rifle cartridges, 4,000 stick grenades, 800 kilograms of medical supplies including morphine that made Kleist weep with relief, 3 tons of pressed hay for the last horses, and thousands of letters from home. Scherer ordered an extra ration distributed that evening. 250 grams of bread per man, an entire spoonful of fat, half a Coca-Cola bar. Civilians received proportional increases. For the first time in 2 weeks, the children stopped crying from hunger. In basements throughout Kholm, men ate slowly, savoring each bite, making the meal last 30 minutes instead of 3. After eating, the letters were distributed. Bags of mail sorted by unit, by name, finding recipients who were alive to receive them, or comrades who would store them for men who had died. A Silesian private received a photograph of his wife holding their newborn son, a child conceived during his last leave and born while he fought at Moscow. He stared at the photograph for 10 minutes without moving, then kissed the image, held it to his chest, and sobbed silently while his squad mates pretended not to notice. Weber received 3 letters from his sister, written over the span of 2 months, each more worried than the last. The final one asked simply, "Are you still alive? Please write. Mama cries every night." He had no way to answer, no way to tell them he survived, that he might continue surviving. The letters were evidence of a world that continued without him, proof that somewhere people worried about his fate. This knowledge provided comfort and pain in the equal measure. Outside in the frozen darkness, the temperature dropped again. -43. The wind picked up, carrying ice crystals that cut exposed skin. But inside the shelters, for the first time since the siege began, there existed something that resembled warmth. Not physical warmth, the cold remained absolute, but warmth that came from full stomachs, from letters from home, from the knowledge that somewhere beyond the Soviet ring, people remembered Kholm and its defenders. The reprieve lasted 1 day. February 8th brought the realization that the Soviets had changed tactics. No more massed assaults against fortified positions. Instead, infiltration. Small groups of 12 to 20 men, specialists trained in urban combat, began working their way into Kholm's interior. These were not conscripts or penal battalions, but elite soldiers. Sappers from the 84th Engineer Battalion, Baltic Fleet sailors with striped shirts under their winter camouflage, Siberians from the 249th Rifle Division, who moved through the ruins like ghosts. The first indication was casualties in rear area positions. A supply depot attacked, 2 guards killed silently with knives. A headquarters runner who never arrived, found hours later with his throat cut. These were not random artillery hits. This was infiltration warfare, and it meant the front line was everywhere. The distinction between safe and dangerous areas erased. At 5:47 on February 8th, Soviet artillery resumed bombardment, but now the guns were closer. Howitzers dragged forward during the night occupied positions less than 2 kilometers away. Shells arrived almost horizontally, whistling brief warnings before impact. In 23 minutes, 1,800 rounds fell on Kholm, concentrating on defensive positions identified through reconnaissance. When the barrage lifted, the assault groups came. Not in waves, but in coordinated strikes against specific buildings, tactics designed to maximize chaos and minimize exposure. Sappers approached through communication trenches dug the previous night, using explosives to breach walls, entering structures from unexpected angles. Naval infantry provided covering fire while Siberians moved through buildings with speed that seemed supernatural. The fighting immediately became intimate and brutal. At the corner of Sadovaya Street, Gefreiter Wilhelm Kohl crouched behind an overturned refrigerator that provided marginal cover. He heard movement, saw a white-clad figure appear 3 meters away. Training took over. He fired from the hip with his MP-40, 3 rounds that caught the Soviet in the chest. The man fell. Another was already coming, launching himself at Kohl with bayonet extended. Kohl blocked with his rifle, the bayonet missing his face by centimeters. The 2 men grappling in the frozen street. The Soviet was stronger, driven by rage or ideology or simple combat fury. He drove Kohl backward, slamming him into a wall hard enough to stun. The world spun. The Soviet raised his rifle for the killing blow. Then Hans Stucker appeared at a basement window, his own bayonet driving through the Soviet's neck from behind. Blood sprayed across Kohl's face, hot and red, the first warmth he had felt in days. The Soviet collapsed on top of him, dead weight that had to be shoved aside. At house number 14 on Pushkinskaya Street, Oberleutnant Kurt Seidlitz defended the ground floor with 4 men. Soviet assault troops entered through the back window, breaking glass and wood with the butts of their rifles. The combat lasted 7 minutes in an area less than 10 square meters, small enough that combatants could not miss. Furniture became weapons and obstacles. A table split in half from a burst of PPSH fire. Herbert Lang, one of Seidlitz's men, took rounds to the abdomen, fell holding his intestines with both hands, trying to stuff them back inside. A Siberian stepped on Lang to reach the next offender. Seidlitz fired his Walther P-38 pistol point blank, 3 shots into the attacker's chest at a range where missing was impossible. The Soviet fell on top of Lang, his weight suffocating the wounded man who was already dying. When the smoke cleared and the last Soviet retreated, only Seidlitz remained standing, his uniform soaked in blood that belonged to 4 different men. Lang was dead, crushed beneath the enemy he had been fighting. Seidlitz stood there for 5 minutes, unable to process survival, before his legs gave out and he collapsed. On Sovetskaya Street, house number 27 became the site of the most absurd combat Kholm had yet witnessed. Germans occupied the basement and attic. Soviets held the ground floor. The interior staircase had been destroyed, meaning the 2 forces were separated by wooden flooring and plaster ceiling, close enough to hear each other moving, speaking, loading weapons. Someone began hammering on the wall with an axe, trying to create a breach. Germans responded by throwing grenades through the stove opening, the explosions contained by the building's structure, magnifying the force. The blasts opened a hole. Hands and legs were visible in the gap, some attached to bodies, some not. Silence followed. Then a voice from the Soviet side, speaking German with heavy accent. Dave Nemci, stavaites, vise ravno pogibnet. Come on, Germans, surrender, you'll die anyway. From the German basement, a response equally weary. Come and Hollands, Iwans. Come get us, Ivans. Neither side advanced. The standoff continued, both groups too exhausted to press the attack, content to hold their respective floors and wait for someone else to break the stalemate. At 2:30 in the afternoon, after 6 hours of fighting that gained and lost ground in increments measured by rooms rather than blocks, Sergeant Major Heinrich Riedel organized the day's most desperate counterattack. Soviets had captured an entire block between Lenina Street and the frozen Lovett River, 180 meters of territory that represented nearly 10% of Kholm's total area. Losing more ground was not sustainable. The pocket was dying by amputation. Riedel, a career soldier whose face bore scars from campaigns in Poland and France, gathered 28 men from 3 different companies. There was no time for planning, no time for reconnaissance. He issued one instruction: throw grenades, then bayonets. Follow me. They emerged from basement shelters like demons from hell, hurling stick grenades through windows of occupied buildings. The explosions were so close that shrapnel struck the attackers themselves. Riedel took fragments in his left arm but kept moving. The assault team went house to house, fighting in stairwells and doorways, where modern weapons became clubs because there was no room to aim. Bayonets found flesh. Rifle butts crushed skulls. Men bit and clawed when weapons jammed or were lost. Franz Meyer, a farmer from Bavaria, killed a Soviet officer with a chair leg, beating him to death when both their rifles were empty and neither could find other weapons. Karl Becker took 17 bayonet and knife wounds but continued fighting, crawling from room to room, shooting Soviet soldiers until he bled out in a doorway, dead but still gripping his pistol. At house number 42 on Lenina Street, the fighting reached its apotheosis of madness. Germans held the basement, Soviets the first floor, the internal staircase destroyed. Both sides decided simultaneously to use explosives to resolve the stalemate. Shaped charges were placed against ceiling and floor, timed to detonate within seconds of each other. When both charges exploded, the building lifted half a meter off its foundation, hung suspended for a moment that seemed to last forever, then collapsed inward, burying everyone inside. When the dust settled, survivors from both sides began digging. The excavation revealed 31 bodies, 19 German, 12 Soviet, crushed together in death's final equality. One survivor was pulled from the rubble, a Soviet lieutenant, both legs shattered, spine probably broken. He was conscious, staring at Riedel with eyes that held no fear, only exhaustion. Ihr seid verrückt. Alle verrückt. You're crazy. All of you crazy. Riedel, covered in dust and blood, nodded slowly. Yeah. Yes, we're crazy. This whole fucking war is crazy. The Soviet lieutenant died 30 seconds later, blood flowing from his mouth in a final exhalation. Riedel stood over the body for a long moment, then turned to his remaining men, 14 out of 28, and gave the only order that made sense. Back to defensive positions. They'll come again tomorrow. By 5:12, the Soviet attack had lost momentum, ground down by casualties that made continued assault counterproductive. They had advanced 220 meters in some sectors, paying for each meter with 3 or 4 men. Their German casualties were proportionally lighter, but still devastating. 187 killed in a single day, 4% of the garrison gone. At this rate, Kholm would be empty of defenders within 3 weeks, even if the Soviets never attacked again. The village itself had become unrecognizable. Buildings that had stood intact that morning were now skeletal ruins. Bodies lay in doorways, hung from windows, sat in chairs as if on guard duty, but frozen, solid in death. The snow, compacted and mixed with blood over days of fighting, had transformed into a pinkish-gray paste that clung to boots like glue. Weapons froze in the hands of corpses, fingers still curled around triggers, last acts preserved by cold that permitted no decay. In some positions, defenders used corpses as part of their barricades. The dead froze quickly and served as shields, absorbing bullets that would otherwise kill the living. This pragmatism horrified new arrivals, but became routine for veterans of the siege. Survival erased scruples. The dead served the living. This was the new morality of Kholm. As darkness fell on February 8th, Scherer walked the defensive lines. His face showed strain for the first time, exhaustion breaking through the Prussian mask. He paused at position after position, touching shoulders, murmuring encouragement that was less words than presence. At one barricade, he found a soldier sitting against a wall, head bowed. Scherer touched the man's shoulder to encourage him. The body fell sideways, dead for hours, held upright only by frost that had frozen him to the wall. In a basement on Pushkinskaya Street, Weber found the young Austrian who had called him an angel 2 nights before. The boy was dead, curled in fetal position, his face peaceful. Hypothermia, most likely. He had simply stopped generating enough heat, and the cold had claimed him while he slept. Weber pulled his coat from the corpse, waist not, and added another name to the mental list of those who would never go home. That night brought no rest. Soviet forces were now close enough that conversations could be heard across no man's land. Coughing, commands shouted. The smell of their campfires drifted into Kholm, wood smoke mixed with cooking meat that made starving defenders salivate involuntarily. The enemy was within 50 meters in some sectors, close enough that grenades could be thrown between positions, close enough that the two armies shared the same frozen hell. Weber wrote in his diary by candlelight, his pencil finally marking paper because someone had provided a writing implement designed for extreme cold. His entry was brief. February 8, 1942. Hans died on the 27th of January. I learned today. I carry his letter. If I survive, I will find his wife. Tell her. The siege tightens. Every street is front line now. Every house is fortress. Every window is arrow slit. Every cellar may be the last thing a man sees. The Soviets are inside the city, breathing our air, waiting for dawn to finish their work. We are not fighting on a battlefield anymore. We are the battlefield. He closed the diary, extinguished the candle to conserve wax, sat in darkness, so complete he could not see his hands. Around him the sounds of Kholm at night, men breathing, some snoring, others whimpering in sleep. Distant artillery, the wind carrying snow that would bury them all eventually. And underneath everything, the awareness that tomorrow would bring more of the same, and the day after that, until either relief came or everyone died. The siege was no longer event. It was existence. This frozen hell had become normal. The violence, the hunger, the cold, the death, all of it routine. Men adapted because humans always adapt, even to circumstances that should shatter them. They found reserves of strength they did not know they possessed. They endured because stopping meant dying, and some stubborn part of human nature refuses that final surrender. Kholm had shrunk to an irregular horseshoe barely a kilometer in diameter. Every building was either fortress or tomb, many both simultaneously. The living walked among ruins inhabited by frozen corpses, the distinction between the two becoming less clear each day. Soviet forces surrounded them completely, outnumbered them 10-1, possessed unlimited ammunition and replacements while German supplies dwindled toward zero. By every rational calculation, Kholm should have fallen. But calculation failed to account for the variable that mattered most. 5,000 men who refused to die on schedule. They would hold one more day, and then another, and another after that. Not from heroism, but from the stubborn arithmetic of existence. We are still here. While we remain, Kholm stands. This was the only equation that mattered. The death bell rang 3 times in the church tower, the sound carrying across frozen ruins. 3 in the morning. The temperature had dropped to -46. Dawn would bring more attacks, more casualties, more fighting for buildings and streets that held no strategic value, except that they were all that remained. But dawn was 3 hours distant. For now in the darkness, there was only cold and exhaustion and the knowledge that they had survived another day. That knowledge, small and terrible as it was, would have to be enough. The buildings began their surrender on February 13th, structures that had withstood centuries of Russian winters finally yielding to sustained bombardment and the weight of accumulated snow. A roof on Lenina Street collapsed at dawn, crushing 3 soldiers who had been sleeping in what they believed was shelter. The collapse made no dramatic sound, just a prolonged creak followed by the muffled crump of timber and bodies compressed together. Rescuers arrived within minutes, but could only dig out corpses, faces peaceful, death instantaneous. By midday, 2 more buildings had failed, their wooden frames stressed beyond tolerance. The pattern accelerated. Structures that appeared intact would suddenly sag, walls bowing outward, roofs caving inward, creating cascades of destruction that buried whatever occupied the interior. Soldiers began sleeping in the open despite the cold, calculating that hypothermia was slower than being crushed. The village was consuming itself, transforming from fortress to tomb without enemy action required. The starvation reached new depths. Official rations had been reduced again, 100 grams of bread per soldier per day, the equivalent of 2 slices. Civilians received 50 grams. Children received whatever their mothers could steal or beg, which was almost nothing. Men moved with the deliberate care of the elderly, conserving every calorie, avoiding unnecessary motion. Speech became economical, words rationed like ammunition. Soldiers lay motionless for hours, burning minimal energy, existing rather than living. Hallucinations became common. A grenadier from Saxony insisted he could smell his grandmother's kitchen, roasting pork and potatoes, the aroma so vivid he followed it through 3 blocks of ruins before collapsing from exhaustion. A machine gunner reported seeing a full banquet table in the middle of Bolshaya Street, complete with roasted goose and fresh bread, candles burning despite the wind. He walked toward it, reaching, before his loader tackled him to prevent him from exposing himself to sniper fire. The table vanished when he hit the ground. Weber discovered a new symptom in himself: time dislocation. He would be standing at one position, then find himself at another with no memory of walking between them. Hours disappeared into blank spaces in his awareness. He compensated by writing everything down, maintaining his diary with fanatical precision, using the act of recording events as proof they had occurred. February 14th, temperature -41. 3 buildings collapsed. 73 men died yesterday from all causes. We have food for 22 more days. Then what? No one discusses then what. The horses, those majestic animals that had pulled artillery and carried officers, were slaughtered one by one as they weakened. Each death was treated as ceremony because horse meat represented survival measured in days. The butchering happened in the courtyard of the old Soviet administrative building, the only space large enough and with drainage that functioned. Men gathered to watch, faces hollow, eyes tracking every cut the butcher made. When the 10th horse was killed on February 16th, its meat was distributed immediately because storage meant theft. 2 kilograms of horse meat per 10 soldiers. The portions were weighed on a scale salvaged from the village store. Accuracy demanded because shortchanging anyone might trigger violence. Soldiers devoured their portions raw, too hungry to wait for cooking, chewing the frozen flesh until it softened enough to swallow. Blood ran down chins, staining beards, a macabre parody of feast. The psychological deterioration manifested in unpredictable ways. A corporal from Hamburg, a baker in civilian life, began kneading imaginary dough in the corner of a basement, working invisible ingredients with the focused concentration of someone at their craft. His squad mates let him continue because the activity seemed to comfort him. He kneaded for 6 hours before stopping, looking at his empty hands with confusion, then weeping. Another soldier, a Bavarian whose name no one remembered, claimed his dead wife was walking through Kholm calling for him. He heard her voice clearly, he insisted, speaking his name in the darkness. His comrades heard nothing. He began leaving his post at night to search for her, wandering through ruins, calling back. On the 3rd night, he didn't return. His body was found at dawn near Soviet lines, throat cut, whether by enemy or his own hand unclear. Weber witnessed a fight over crumbs. 2 soldiers who had been friends since training, now grappling in the snow over bread fragments that totaled perhaps 10 grams. They fought with the intensity of mortal enemies, punching and choking until separated by others. Both sat afterward, weeping, horrified by what hunger had reduced them to. Neither apologized. Apology required energy they no longer possessed. Yet through this dissolution, Scherer maintained his ritual. Every day, regardless of artillery or temperature or exhaustion, he walked the defensive perimeter. Not inspecting, there was nothing left to inspect, but simply being present, letting defenders see him, touch him, confirm that commands still functioned, even if nothing else did. He stopped at each position, made eye contact with each man, sometimes speaking, often not. His presence communicated what words could not. You are not alone in this hell. At one position on February 18th, Scherer found a soldier sitting against rubble, staring at nothing. The general crouched beside him, joints protesting the movement, and simply sat. 5 minutes passed in silence. Then the soldier spoke, voice barely audible. Why do we keep fighting, Herr General? What's the point when we're all going to die here anyway? Scherer considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because dying tomorrow is not the same as dying today, and we are not dead today. The soldier thought about this, then nodded once. Scherer stood, patted the man's shoulder, and continued his rounds. Behind him, the soldier picked up his rifle, checked the action, and returned to watching his sector. The exchange had taken 90 seconds. Those 90 seconds might have saved the man's life by giving him reason to continue. The civilians suffered worse than soldiers. They had no military discipline to structure their days, no mission to provide purpose, nothing but survival stripped to its most basic form. Russian families huddled in cellars, sharing body heat, consuming their own reserves until no reserves remained. The old died first, metabolism unable to compensate for caloric deficit. They went peacefully usually, falling asleep and not waking, bodies discovered only when they began to stiffen. Old Dmitri lasted until February 20th. Weber found him in the basement where he had been sheltering with Katya. The old man sat propped against the wall, eyes closed, beard frosted with ice from his final breaths. Katya sat beside him, holding his hand, not crying because she had no tears left. She looked at Weber with those enormous dark eyes that had seen too much for 8 years of life. Dedushka gone, like Mama, like Papa. Everyone gone. Weber knelt beside her, this child who represented every innocence destroyed by war. He had nothing to offer, no food, no warmth, no comfort that wasn't a lie. So he told her the truth. I can't promise we'll survive, but while we're alive, I'll make sure you have shelter. That's all I can give. Katya nodded, accepting this inadequate offering, because it was more than most received. Weber wrapped her in Dmitri's coat, added her to the list of orphans being tracked by the quartermaster, and arranged for her to shelter with a group of women who still had strength enough to care for a child. It was insufficient. Everything was insufficient, but it was what existed. February 21st brought the night when psychological endurance began fracturing on massive scale. At 11:11, precisely timed as if Soviet commanders understood the power of specific moments, a single rifle shot cracked through the darkness. Obergefreiter Heinrich Lent, smoking a cigarette in a forward position, jerked backward, a hole appearing in his forehead where none had existed an instant before. Soviet sniper, operating at night, patient enough to wait for the cigarette's glow to provide targeting reference. Lent's comrades didn't dare retrieve his body. They knew the sniper was waiting for exactly that response. 30 minutes later, a 6-man Soviet patrol materialized from darkness, so complete it seemed they were born from it. They cut wire with shears wrapped in cloth to silence the snapping, threw 2 grenades through the window of a house sheltering 12 Germans, and vanished before return fire could be organized. The grenades detonated in an enclosed space, the overpressure alone enough to kill. Bodies were unrecognizable, reduced to constituent parts scattered across walls and ceiling. The survivors from adjacent buildings heard the explosion, but could do nothing except wait for dawn and hope they weren't next. At 1:40, the loudspeakers started, mounted on sleds 800 meters from German lines, powered by generators that hummed like insects. They broadcast at volume that carried across the entire pocket. First came music, a Russian waltz, melancholy and beautiful. The kind played at dances before the world went insane. The melody drifted through ruins, into basements, wrapping around soldiers trying to sleep, impossible to ignore or escape. Then the voice, female, young, speaking German with perfect pronunciation, and an accent that could have originated anywhere from Berlin to Vienna. Her tone was gentle, almost motherly, the voice of someone who cared deeply about the listener's welfare. Soldaten der Wehrmacht, you have been abandoned. Your commanders have fled. Your Führer has forgotten you. Berlin celebrated Christmas while you froze. There is no help coming, no rescue, no relief. You will die in Kholm, every one of you, for a cause that no longer exists. But it doesn't have to be this way. The voice paused, letting silence emphasize the message, then continued. Softer now, intimate. Come to us. Bring your weapons or leave them, we don't care. We have hot food, real bread, tea with sugar, warm barracks, medical care. And after the war ends, we will send you home. To your wives, your children, your mothers who pray for you every night. All you must do is walk west. We won't shoot. We promise. Just walk toward the lights and this nightmare ends. The broadcast repeated for 3 hours. The same message in slightly varying form, interspersed with music that made homesickness a physical pain in the chest. In some shelters, soldiers began to cry. In others, men put hands over their ears, humming to block the sound. A Bavarian corporal, the one who had lost 3 toes to frostbite, suddenly stood and tried to run outside, screaming, "Ich will nach Hause, I want to go home." His squad mates tackled him, brought him down hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. They tied his hands with bootlaces, gagged him with a rag to muffle the screaming that wouldn't stop. He thrashed for 10 minutes before exhaustion claimed him. They left him bound because releasing him meant risking another attempt. By morning, he had lost his mind entirely, staring at walls, speaking to people only he could see. At 3:05, a new sound joined the symphony of psychological assault. Shovels striking frozen earth, hundreds of them, rhythmic and relentless. The Soviets were digging approach trenches, advancing their lines meter by meter under cover of darkness. The sound was worse than artillery because artillery was impersonal. This was deliberate, methodical, patient. The sound of doom approaching one shovelful at a time. Tack, 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 like a clock counting down the hours remaining. In a basement on Pushkinskaya Street, Katya suddenly began screaming. Not the scream of a frightened child, but something primal, a sound no human should make. The women tried to comfort her, but she fought them, pointing at the corner where a soldier's corpse had been leaning against the wall for 3 days, too frozen to move, the ground too hard to bury. Rats. She saw rats eating the corpse's face, their teeth scraping flesh from bone, whiskers twitching as they fed. The scream echoed through the basement, out into the street, carrying farther than seemed possible. Within minutes, a Soviet mortar shell fell on that location, zeroing on the sound. The basement entrance collapsed, burying everyone inside. Soldiers from adjacent positions attempted rescue, but the rubble was frozen solid, impossible to shift without equipment they didn't possess. They heard muffled voices for perhaps 30 minutes, then silence. 27 people died in that basement, 14 soldiers, 12 civilian women, and Katya, the little girl with enormous eyes who had shared her bread with a German mechanic before the world collapsed. Weber learned of her death at dawn. He had promised to protect her, had made a commitment knowing it was probably empty, and now she was dead because he couldn't control rats or Soviet mortars or any of the 1,000 variables that killed in siege warfare. He added her name to the mental list that grew longer each day. Another failure in a campaign of failures. Another innocence destroyed. The nights continued in this pattern. Snipers picking off the careless, infiltration patrols probing for weakness. Loudspeakers promising salvation that everyone knew was lies, yet couldn't help but imagine. The digging sounds growing louder as Soviet trenches crept closer. And through it all, the cold that never relented, killing as effectively as bullets, just slower, more certain. February 26th brought intelligence that transformed despair into something resembling possibility. Though possibility seemed too strong a word for the situation. A Luftwaffe reconnaissance flight, risking Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire, photographed German forces moving toward Kholm from the west. The 5th Jaeger Division, the 122nd Infantry Division, elements of SS Totenkopf, all advancing through territory the Soviets had considered pacified. The relief operation had begun. Scherer convened his officers to share this information. The basement headquarters was colder than outside now, heat from bodies insufficient to warm stone walls. The assembled officers looked more like concentration camp survivors than military men, uniforms hanging on frames that had lost 20 or 30 pounds, faces gaunt, eyes sunken. But when Scherer spread the map showing German forces 50 kilometers away and advancing, something flickered in those dead eyes. Not hope. Hope required energy, but perhaps interest in continued survival. Relief forces are advancing. They face determined Soviet resistance and must fight for every kilometer. Current estimates suggest they could reach us in 7 to 10 days. Possibly sooner if weather improves. Possibly never if Soviet reinforcements arrive first. Our task remains unchanged. Survive until relief arrives or until we cannot survive any longer. A lieutenant from the 123rd Division, his face bearing burn scars from fighting in January, raised a skeletal hand. Herr General, We have food for perhaps 12 more days, ammunition for 4 days of heavy combat. If relief takes 10 days, mathematics suggests we'll be dead when they arrive. Scherer looked at the lieutenant with those ice-blue eyes that had witnessed Verdun, that had seen impossibility before, and survived it. Then we reduce rations further. We conserve ammunition. We fight with bayonets and bare hands if necessary. The relief forces are moving. While they move, we hold. This is not negotiable. But Scherer knew the mathematics as well as the lieutenant. The garrison numbered approximately 3,800 now, reduced from 5,500 through combat losses, disease, starvation, and cold. At current attrition rates, they would lose another 100 men per week even without major combat. Food stocks were critically low. Medical supplies were exhausted. The only morphine remaining was extracted from the dead. Their bodies searched before they froze solid. Sulfa drugs had run out in early February. Bandages were reused until they disintegrated. The inventory conducted that day revealed the stark numbers. 400 kilograms of horse meat from the last 3 horses, slaughtered February 24th. 180 kilograms of bread so moldy it was more green than black. No fat, no sugar, no coffee substitute, no tobacco. Water from melted snow that caused dysentery in 80% of those who consumed it. Ammunition stocks sufficient for perhaps 3 hours of intense combat, after which defenders would fight with bayonets, clubs, or stones. Yet they persisted. The daily routine continued because routine was all that separated men from animals. Sentries maintained watch despite knowing Soviet snipers hunted them. Work parties cleared rubble, even though cleared spaces would fill again with the next bombardment. The wounded received care despite absent supplies, doctors doing what they could with boiled water and prayers. Life, such as it was, continued. Weber's diary entries became shorter, conserving paper and pencil lead, both irreplaceable. February 27th. Relief forces 50 kilometers away. We have food for 11 days. If they arrive on day 12, we'll be too weak to fight beside them. If they arrive on day 15, we'll be dead. Everything depends on speed we cannot control. February 28th. Temperature -38. Warmer than last week, but still deadly. Found soldier frozen in sitting position, rifle across his lap, eyes open. Dead for hours, perhaps since last night. Used as decoy by his squad to draw sniper fire. This is what we've become. March 1st. Heard artillery from west. Heavy caliber, German 150 mm or 150 mm by sound. Relief forces engaging. They're coming. We need to last 5 more days. Maybe 4, maybe 6. No one knows. We eat horse meat raw because cooking fuel is gone. It tastes of nothing. Everything tastes of nothing. On March 2nd, the Soviet assault intensified, as if enemy commanders understood time was running short to crush Kholm before relief arrived. Artillery bombardment resumed at levels not seen since late January, 1,800 shells in 4 hours, systematically destroying what remained standing. The Orthodox Church, damaged but functional since the siege began, took multiple direct hits. The tower collapsed, the death bell falling silent mid-toll, crashing through floors until it reached the basement and embedded itself in stone. The assault that followed was Soviet desperation translated to violence. Not the careful infiltration tactics of February, but massed attacks reminiscent of January, human waves supplemented by T-34 tanks that ground through rubble, crushing defensive positions beneath their treads. The defenders fought with everything remaining: bullets until magazines emptied, grenades until crates emptied, then bayonets, then entrenching tools, then hands and teeth and whatever rocks could be thrown. A tank reached Bolshaya Street, the first Soviet armor to penetrate that deep. Its gun traversed, firing high-explosive rounds into buildings at point-blank range, each shot obliterating another defensive position. German soldiers with no anti-tank weapons attempted desperate measures. One soldier, never identified, climbed onto the tank's rear deck, pried open the engine cover, and dropped a stick grenade into the machinery. The explosion disabled the engine but also killed the soldier. The tank crew escaped through hatches, were shot within seconds. By nightfall, the Soviets had advanced 300 meters on the southern perimeter. the deepest penetration since the siege began. German forces counterattacked after dark, fighting house to house again, reclaiming some ground but not all. The pocket had shrunk to barely a square kilometer, so small that Soviet artillery could hit any target within it without adjustment fire. There was no rear area anymore. Every position was front line. Every soldier was forward observer for an artillery strike that could arrive any second. March 3rd brought the sound of salvation. German artillery, close enough that the muzzle flashes were visible on the western horizon. The relief forces had pushed to within 15 kilometers, close enough that their guns could provide indirect support if observers could spot targets. Weber, still functional as artillery coordinator, despite everything, attempted to establish communication. The radio was dead. The signal lamps were destroyed. The only option was colored flares, a primitive system that required Soviet forces not to intercept the signals. At noon, Weber fired a green flare, the code for need fire support. 30 seconds later, a green answering flare rose from the west. Contact established. Over the next hour, using a system so crude it belonged to the previous century, Weber directed artillery fire onto Soviet positions. Red flare meant adjust left. White flare meant adjust right. Green meant fire for effect. The German 150 mm howitzers began landing shells on Soviet assembly areas, disrupting attacks, buying time measured in hours. But everyone understood hours were insufficient. The garrison was collapsing from internal causes, faster than relief could arrive from external sources. Men were falling unconscious at their positions, too weak to continue. The wounded died not from their wounds, but from lack of strength to heal. Disease, dormant during the worst cold, was now spreading as temperatures rose to merely freezing. Dysentery, typhus, pneumonia. The medical staff could only count the dying, unable to treat them. On March 4th, Scherer issued an order that acknowledged reality. All soldiers still capable of combat report to perimeter positions. All wounded unable to fight consolidate in central shelters. All civilians remain in basements and do not emerge for any reason. We are making final stand. God be with us. Weber reported to a barricade on the western perimeter, the direction from which relief would come if it came at all. Around him assembled the ghosts of the garrison that had arrived in January. Men who had weighed 80 kilograms now weighed 50. Uniforms hung on frames that resembled famine victims more than soldiers. Yet they checked their weapons with professional care, distributed the last ammunition, prepared firing positions as if this were training exercise rather than likely final battle. The night of March 4th to March 5th was the longest of the siege. No one slept. Soviet forces launched probing attacks every hour, testing defenses, seeking the weakness that would allow final breakthrough. German forces repelled each attack with decreasing effectiveness. Bullets replaced by bayonets, bayonets replaced by clubs, clubs replaced by desperate hand-to-hand grappling. Some positions changed hands 3 times in that night. German and Soviet corpses piling together in the darkness. At 4:30 on the morning of March 5th, Weber heard something that didn't fit the acoustic pattern of siege warfare. A sound from the west, mechanical and rhythmic. Engines, multiple engines. Not the diesel rattle of Soviet T-34s, but the higher-pitched whine of German vehicles. He stared into the pre-dawn darkness, unwilling to believe, afraid that belief would shatter against reality. Then muzzle flashes appeared, kilometers distant but unmistakable. German weapons, firing at Soviet positions, advancing fire that meant mobile warfare rather than static siege. The relief forces were conducting their final push. The sound of combat grew louder, closer, a tide approaching. And then, visible through the murk, shapes emerging from the western forest. White camouflaged figures, but these moved with purpose different from Soviet assault troops. These were advancing toward Kholm, not to destroy it but to reach it. Scherer, informed of the developments, issued his final order of the siege. All units, prepare for breakout on my signal. We attack west with everything remaining. Link with relief forces, fight through or die trying. At 6 OIG, as gray dawn light finally penetrated clouds, Scherer fired a red flare, the signal to attack. 400 men, all that remained combat-capable from the original 5,500, emerged from positions they had held for 70 days. They advanced through ruins they had defended meter by meter, past barricades built with their own hands, over ground saturated with the blood of their comrade. Soviet forces, surprised by the suddenly aggressive defenders, initially fell back. Then they rallied, understanding this was the moment that would decide Kholm's fate. If the pocket could be sealed shut before relief arrived, the siege could still be won. The fighting became apocalyptic, all restraint abandoned, both sides knowing this was the final calculation. Weber was in the advance, MP-40 firing until empty, then using it as a club when ammunition exhausted. He crossed the defensive perimeter, passed into no man's land, saw Soviet soldiers falling back toward their own lines. And then, 300 meters ahead, figures in German uniforms advancing from the opposite direction. The relief forces. They were real. They were here. The two groups met in the middle of what had been farmland before artillery turned it into moonscape. Weber found himself facing a Jaeger lieutenant, clean-shaven, uniform intact, face showing shock at the condition of the men he was rescuing. The lieutenant stared at Weber, skeletal, filthy, uniform in rags, face burned by cold and sun until barely recognizable as human. Mein Gott, ihr seid noch am Leben? My God, you're still alive? Weber looked at this representative of a world beyond Kholm, a world where men ate regularly and slept in heated barracks and didn't use frozen corpses as building materials, and felt the distance between them as unbridgeable. Yes, we're alive, some of us. The rest are back there. He gestured toward Kholm, or what remained of it. Smoke rose from 100 fires. Buildings that had sheltered thousands were now skeletal ruins. The landscape resembled an archaeological site, something ancient and cursed. The lieutenant looked past Weber at the other survivors filtering through the corridor, and understanding dawned on his face. These were not soldiers anymore. These were survivors of something that had stripped away everything except the stubborn refusal to die. The corridor established on March 5th was 500 meters wide, under constant Soviet artillery and small arms fire from both flanks. Evacuation began immediately. The wounded carried on stretchers, the mobile walking in columns, everyone moving as fast as strength allowed. Soviet forces attempted to close the corridor repeatedly over the next hours, launching attacks that were repelled only through combined efforts of relief forces and the remnants of Kholm's garrison fighting as rearguard. By nightfall, 3,500 men had escaped the pocket. 800 remained inside, too wounded to move or too weak to walk. They would be evacuated over the following days as the corridor widened and stabilized. Some would survive, most would not. The final count would show that of the 5,500 who entered Kholm in January, 3,200 emerged alive. 2,300 died in the siege or shortly after from wounds and disease. A 40% casualty rate over 70 days of siege warfare. Soviet losses were estimated at 12 to 15,000, though exact numbers were never confirmed. The entire operation had been a mathematical atrocity, trading human lives for strategic objectives measured in days of delay. Kholm had held, but the cost made victory meaningless. Weber walked out of Kholm on March 6th, 3 days after the corridor opened, once his presence was no longer needed for coordination. He carried his diary, Hans's letter and photograph, and a burden of memory that would never lighten. Behind him, the village burned, Soviet forces shelling the ruins despite their emptiness, erasing evidence of what had occurred there. He was evacuated to a field hospital 20 kilometers west, where doctors examined him with clinical detachment. 15 kilograms below healthy weight, 2 toes lost to frostbite, chronic dysentery, possible tuberculosis, severe malnutrition, psychological trauma, observed but not diagnosed because combat fatigue was not yet recognized as legitimate medical condition. He was given food, real food, soup and bread and meat that sat in his stomach like stones because his digestive system had forgotten how to process nutrition. He vomited everything for 3 days before his body relearned the mechanics of eating. In the hospital, he wrote his final entries about Kholm. The words came slowly, his hand trembling from weakness and emotion. March 10th, 1942. Out 1 week. Still doesn't seem real. Keep expecting to wake up back in the basement, cold and hungry, artillery falling. But this is real. The clean sheets, the food, the absence of death. They call us heroes. Scherer received the Ritterkreuz mit Eichenlaub. Propaganda shows us as invincible. But we know the truth. There was no heroism, only desperate struggle of humans reduced to extreme limit. We held positions because there was nowhere else to go. His pen paused, considering what more could be said, what truth could be extracted from 70 days of frozen hell. Then he continued. I remember Hans. I remember Katya. I remember Dmitri. I remember the Austrian boy who called me an angel. I remember hundreds whose names I never learned. No one should die as they died. Kholm was not victory, it was survival. And survival is not triumph. It is simply not dying for another day. He closed the diary, placed it with Hans's letter in a package he would eventually send to Hamburg, fulfilling a promise made to a corpse frozen in a village courtyard. The letter found its recipient in 1943. Hans's wife, who had remarried believing herself a widow, learned that her first husband had died fighting in a place she had never heard of, for reasons no one could adequately explain. She kept the letter and photograph. Years later, her daughter would find them and learn about the father she never knew. Scherer received his decoration at a ceremony in Berlin, standing before Hitler himself, the hero of Kholm, the lion who had held against impossible odds. He accepted with Prussian reserve, saying nothing about the price paid, the men who froze and starved and died in increments. He returned to command, fought through 1943 and 1944, survived the war, and died in 1951, aged 61, having never spoken to his family about Kholm. Some things are too heavy to share. Weber returned to Hamburg, found the city damaged by British bombing but still functioning. He could not resume teaching. Standing before students and lecturing about history seemed obscene after living it. He opened a bookshop, surrounding himself with stories that were contained and concluded, unlike the story of Kholm, which had no proper ending. He kept his diary locked in a safe until 1970, when he donated it to a military museum with the stipulation that it not be published until after his death. He died in 1976. The diary was published in 1978. Kholm itself was rebuilt after the war, becoming a small town in the Novgorod Oblast of Soviet Russia. Few residents knew what had occurred there in 1942. The defensive positions eroded over decades. The mass graves were left unmarked. A small memorial was erected for Soviet soldiers who died in the liberation. The word liberation doing considerable work to describe what had actually happened. No memorial was built for the German defenders. They remained as they were in life, alone, forgotten, buried in foreign soil. The siege entered military history as a footnote, a curiosity about the Eastern Front's brutal arithmetic. Analysts studied it for lessons about defensive operations, about the importance of air resupply, about psychological factors in isolated garrison morale. But these analyses missed the fundamental truth. Kholm demonstrated not the power of military science, but the capacity of humans to endure what should annihilate them. The impossible was not overcome through brilliant tactics or superior weapons. It was survived through desperate stubbornness, through the refusal to surrender when surrender was the only logical choice. The legacy of Kholm was not strategic, it was personal, carried by survivors who never escaped its frozen grip. Men who returned to peacetime found themselves unable to explain to those who hadn't been there what it meant to be that hungry, that cold, that certain of death yet continuing anyway. They tried. Veterans' meetings, memoirs, interviews with historians. But words failed to convey the essential experience. How do you explain to someone who has never been truly cold what -48 feels like? How do you describe hunger that makes you hallucinate food? How do you communicate the sound of a death bell ringing in an artillery bombardment? You cannot. The experience remains locked inside those who lived it, a private hell shared only with others who were there. And as those others died, as decades passed and memories faded, Kholm became less event than legend. The siege that should not have been survived. The frozen pocket that held when all reason demanded collapse. the village that became tomb and fortress simultaneously. Spring came to Kholm eventually, melting the snow, revealing what winter had concealed. Bodies emerged from drifts, hundreds of them, German and Soviet and civilian mixed together. Weapons embedded in mud reappeared like archaeological artifacts. The thaw released smells that had been frozen. Decomposition, excrement, burnt wood, all the perfumes of siege warfare. Villagers who had fled returned to find their homes destroyed, their lives obliterated by events beyond their control or understanding. The snow melted. The bodies were buried. The ruins were cleared. Life, such as it could be after such devastation, resumed. Children who would never remember the siege played in streets where men had fought and died. New buildings rose where old ones had fallen. Time, that great eraser, began its work. But the memory persisted, in Weber's diary, in Scherer's decorations, in the nightmares of survivors who woke screaming decades after the event, in the unmarked graves scattered throughout Kholm and its surroundings, in the gap at family tables where fathers and sons and husbands should have sat but never would again. Memory, it turned out, was the one thing that could not be killed by bullets or cold or time. The siege became a whisper in history's wind, a harsh, melancholy whisper laden with courage and suffering in measures that defied separation. It whispered of ordinary men pushed to extraordinary limits, of the price survival demands, of the mathematics that measure human lives against strategic objectives and find the calculation obscene. It whispered that sometimes the impossible is survived not through strength, but through desperate refusal to quit, through stubborn insistence on breathing one more minute, one more hour, one more day. And even today, when someone revisits this story, reads the accounts, studies the maps, tries to understand how 5,500 men held against 50,000 for 70 days in conditions designed to kill them all, they do not see glory. They see struggle. Human beings confronting their absolute limits and discovering that those limits stretch farther than anyone imagined. They see the cost of that discovery. They see the price paid by every man who stood in Kholm's ruins and decided, against all logic and sanity, to stay. That is why the siege should not have been survived. The mathematics were clear, the outcome certain. Death was scheduled, arranged, guaranteed by cold and hunger and overwhelming enemy force. But death's schedule meant nothing to men who refused to honor it. They survived because they chose to, because surrendering felt worse than continuing, because something fundamental in human nature rejects the inevitability of defeat until defeat becomes absolutely unavoidable. They survived, but they never recovered. The rest of their lives were postscripts to those 70 days, footnotes to the main text written in frozen blood on streets none of them could forget. Kholm ended in March 1942, but for those who endured it, Kholm never ended. It persisted in dreams and daylight, in every cold wind, in every hunger pang, in every moment of comfort that felt undeserved because their comrades never experienced it. The siege became the lens through which they viewed everything after. Peacetime luxuries seemed excessive. Civilian complaints seemed trivial. Life itself seemed borrowed, temporary, liable to be revoked at any moment by forces beyond control. They had learned the fundamental lesson of Kholm. We are all one catastrophe away from discovering what we are capable of enduring, and that knowledge once gained could never be unlearned. Kholm, the island in the storm, the pocket that refused to collapse, the village where 5,000 souls held against impossible odds, not through heroism, but through the arithmetic of survival. One more breath. One more heartbeat. One more day. Add those days together and you get 70. Add those 70 days together and you get a story that should end in annihilation, but ends instead in survival so costly it resembles defeat. The cold is melted. The bodies are buried. The ruins are rebuilt. But the memory remains, will always remain. Because some experiences are too profound to forget, too significant to dismiss, too terrible to fully comprehend, yet too important to ignore. Kholm is all of these. And though the last survivors have died and the physical evidence has eroded and the strategic significance has faded, the essential truth persists. They held. Against every calculation, every prediction, every reasonable expectation, they held, not because they were special or superhuman or blessed by providence, but because they were human, and humans possess a capacity for stubborn endurance that exceeds what any military manual accounts for. They held because stopping felt impossible, because their comrades beside them had not stopped, because giving up meant betraying everyone who had already died holding the same position. In the end, Kholm was not about military strategy or tactical brilliance or operational art. It was about the human capacity to endure, about discovering that the breaking point we believe exists is actually more flexible than we imagine, about learning that survival is not gift or accident, but choice, made continuously, minute by minute, despite everything arguing for surrender. The siege that should not have been survived was survived. This fact alone is the legacy, not the decorations or the propaganda or the historical analyses. Just the simple, terrible, magnificent fact. They lived when they should have died. And in living, they demonstrated something about human nature that no amount of peace can teach and no amount of time can erase. Calm, frozen in terror, forever.